Thank you all for joining us. The webcast will begin in just a few moments. Hello, and thank you to everyone for joining us for today's live webcast, Geopolitical Risk in Iran, Trade, Business, and the Nuclear Deal, brought to you by Stratfor Worldview. I'm Joshua Cook with Stratfor, a geopolitical intelligence platform headquartered in Austin, Texas. With the future of the JCPOA in question, Iran continuing to contribute to simmering tensions within the Middle East, questions remain as to how international businesses, governments, and non-governmental organizations engaged in the region can plan for future scenarios. We'll welcome our analyst team to discuss key points of geopolitical risk and international constraints related to Iran in just a few moments. But first, some quick notes about today's presentation. We will be live streaming today's video presentation. That means that video quality will vary based on your internet connection. If you encounter any technical issues during the webcast, please try to reconnect or refresh your browser. Also know that we'll share a link to the recorded webcast following today's live presentation. Today's webcast will run about 45 minutes in all, and we'll reserve the second half of the event for your questions. Now, if you're joining us live, you may submit those questions at any time in the window to the right side of your browser. Once we get to the Q&A portion, our presenters will respond to as many of your questions as possible in the time we have remaining. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today's Stratfor Worldview webcast on geopolitical risk in Iran. Matthew Bay is a senior global analyst with Stratfor. He monitors a broad range of global issues and trends with a particular focus on energy and political developments in OPEC member states. His work includes analysis on the consequences of geopolitical developments on oil producers and the international energy market. Emily Hawthorne is a Middle East and North Africa analyst with Stratfor. She monitors both the political, business, and security developments across the region. And at this time, I'd like to hand things over to our moderator for today's webcast on geopolitical risk in Iran, Stratfor Managing Editor, Ben Sheen. Ben?
Welcome to everybody online. I think before we get into the scenarios that we've built out surrounding geopolitical risk in Iran, it's important to look at some of the context surrounding the simmering rivalry between the United States and Iran. And for that, Emily, can you explain some of the background to why these tensions exist in the first place and what we're looking at within the Middle East itself?
Yeah, we're really at this unique moment in the U.S.-Iran relationship, and we're seeing a very strong, concerted anti-Iran stance in Washington. And this is not just coming from the Trump administration in the White House. This is coming from military establishment, as well as from various financial and business leaders. There really is a shared sense that Iran is a destabilizing force in the Middle East, and that affects global stability at large. So from this, we've seen a more concerted effort to try and contain Iranian activity starting in the Middle East. Right now, there's a large focus on the ballistic missile program that Iran has maintained and intends to maintain, as well as the various militias that Iran backs in the Middle East, especially as we're at this critical juncture at the end of some of the conventional battles against the Islamic State group, and some of those militias have had a key role in that. So the United States is really looking at this as, how do we work to contain some of the destabilizing activities that Iran is engaged in? And they would like to use the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, as a tool to do that. The problem is, as we'll get into in a little bit, that deal wasn't really written in order to contain that kind of activity. So we come to this this tricky moment where the Trump administration decided not to certify the JCPOA to Congress in mid-October, so just a month ago, and has unveiled a new 4-point strategy to try and contain Iran that still maintains the nuclear activity that Iran has in one box and everything else that Iran is doing in other boxes. So by focusing on some of those other boxes, the Washington is trying to contain what Iran does in terms of terrorist activity, in terms of military activity that doesn't jive with what the United States thinks is best in the Middle East. And those 4 points are curtailing the ballistic missile program and countering Iranian activities in MENA. And for that, the United States is really weighing heavily on some of the United States allies, including Saudi Arabia. So we're seeing really a sharp uptick in some of the tensions in the Middle East, in part because of the United States support for how Saudi Arabia also agrees with the United States and thinks, hey, Iran is our biggest problem in the Middle East. We're on the same page as you about this. Let's work to contain some of what Iran is doing. So this has put the nuclear deal in an uncertain state. And it's really made it such that there are a lot of non-nuclear related sanctions that are coming out of Washington, and we should expect to continue to see that.
So before we focus on some of the impact of the lifting of sanctions themselves, I'd just like to talk a little bit, Matt, on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. Right. Where are we now with the JCPOA?
So the JCPOA is still in flux. The last few weeks, the United States has basically been looking at ways to amend the law that would be able to look at the Review Act. So, for example, when the United States passed this in 2015, the Congress wasn't sure or wasn't comfortable with the Obama administration being able to overlook activities that Iran had done on its nuclear program. So they put into place a number of different constraints on, or basically triggers that they could then act in order to reimpose sanctions if Iran violated the deal. So once the United States or President Trump actually decertified the deal at Congress, that kicked off a 60-day period where Congress can vote to reapply sanctions. Now, that really isn't so much the significant thing anymore, because now we have a Republican-led Congress. They're talking about just modifying the Review Act itself, as opposed to actually using the act in the way that it was originally written to be done. Now, going back to the JCPOA at large, we have to remember that it largely took away the sanction or froze sanctions in the U.S., but it actually took away sanctions from the EU. So if we're talking about the United States trying to build the same sort of coalition that we saw before the nuclear deal, you would have to get through a lot of European troubles. You'd have to get all the Europeans on board in all of this.
We should probably say what exactly the JCPOA did when it was signed and when it was implemented. What kind of sanctions did it freeze?
So in the United States, the United States froze secondary sanctions largely. So these are sanctions that prevent or would go on European companies that did business with Iran. So, for example, if a European energy company invested in Iran, they could be then cut off from the U.S. financial system. What it did not touch, for example, though, was any U.S. companies that were doing business in Iran. So if you are a U.S. energy company, you still cannot do business with Iran. And then, of course, the EU, it was basically them removing all the sanctions on EU companies. Still, so U.S. companies still largely are, and to this day, cannot be involved in Iran's energy sector or any other industry for that matter. But more importantly, I think that we should be looking at here, though, is that there's a distinction between sanctions that are related to the nuclear program and sanctions that are related to the other activities that Iran does, like its destabilizing activities in these proxy theaters or its ballistic missile program. So what the United States has done thus far is essentially said that anything that's in the JCPOA, so if Iran violates the nuclear deal, then I will apply those sanctions that targeted its nuclear sector, which are the big secondary sanctions on EU companies, for example. But any sanctions or any activities that Iran does that do not violate the JCPOA, but I don't like, I will sanction Iran, but not in a way that I actually then put in the sanctions that I promised to give up in the nuclear deal. So, for example, sanctioning the IRGC to a certain degree is one of those.
So what I'm taking away from this is that the United States and Europe, there are slightly differing approaches to how they perceive what Iran does in terms of its foreign policy in the region, and also things that conform to the JCPOA itself. And certainly the US-Europe distinction is important. But I have a question for Emily. How precarious position is the JCPOA in right now at this moment?
Right. So when we had President Trump choose not to recertify the JCPOA to Congress in October, it really he passed the ball to Congress to decide what to do on either whether or not to snap back some of those nuclear-related sanctions. But we know that that was one thing that happened when President Trump decided not to certify the deal. That we know feeds into this US-EU tensions, because we know that the Congress right now is very cognizant of the threat that Russia presents to the United States. And so the United States Congress in general is concerned about anything that could insert another wedge between the US and its EU allies. As you mentioned, the US and the EU are really not on the same page on exactly how to limit Iranian activity. And the EU allies in general are pretty much on the same page in terms of wanting to keep the JCPOA as it's written. They were not thrilled about the United States not certifying the deal in October. And so we come to this, there's this delta between exactly how to move forward. So this precarious stage that we're in is that the United States has not really shown a significant show of confidence that they're willing to continue supporting the JCPOA into the future, whereas the EU in general is saying, we want this deal to stay in place. Everything that Iran has done up to this point has shown that it's been compliant with the deal as written. And we think that if you want to limit anything else that Iran is doing in the region with its militias and with its missiles, there are other ways that we can come together and do that. But please, work with us on keeping the nuclear deal intact.
And one significant thing on that is remember that the EU itself does have some levers that it can do within this. It was a negotiation between three members of the EU itself, Russia, and China. It was not just between the United States and Iran. And significantly, if the United States were to pull out of the JCPOA and actually start reapplying sanctions on European companies, this is something that would essentially be the extraterritorial application of U.S. law. This is something that has never really flown that well in European capitals. It first came up about in the 1990s, not only when the United States was trying to apply sanctions on Iran, but also sanctions on Cuba. The Europeans actually brought this up in the WTO. So that is one of the routes that we could see going forward. And we've already seen Iran really try to lean heavily on the relationship with the Europeans to kind of have a united front against actually reopening negotiations moving forward.
And just to summarize exactly where we're at with the JCPOA, it is still in place largely because Iran wants it to remain in place. The EU allies want it to remain in place. As Matthew mentioned, Russia and China, the other members of the P5+1 that signed this deal, they want it in place. And so the US is certainly the most powerful actor that was party to this deal. But everyone else that signed on to it wants to keep it in place. So the US is really kind of in its own boat on this. And so it's going to be, so while the deal does technically remain in place as written, there are various things that the United States can choose to do moving forward that could essentially render that deal weaker and weaker and weaker. And that's what Iran is trying to circumvent. That's what the EU is trying to circumvent, as well as Russia and China.
And right now the ball is in the US's court.
Right.
So that's a really good point, because there's a number of ways in which this can play out. What I'd like to do now is look at some of the scenarios that we've actually gamed out and how this situation could develop and evolve. And before we really get into the risks and opportunities of each scenario, just what are we looking at?
So I think there are four scenarios that are worth detailing out and thinking about. I think the first scenario is one that is kind of this weird status quo where the United States continues to only apply sanctions that it promised to give up in the nuclear deal when Iran violates the nuclear deal, and anything that Iran does outside of the nuclear deal, the United States will respond in kind. Now, the United States is basically trying to codify some of this aspects in the Nuclear Review Act, which is the stuff that the Congress is working through right now. So that's one scenario. And then there's a second scenario where some of those triggers that would become automatic based on Iran's activity, where the United States might actually, instead of keeping those things separate, will blur that distinction. So, for example, if Iran were to do a ballistic missile test or support a terrorist group that then conducts a major attack in Manama or Riyadh, etc., the U.S. could apply some of those secondary sanctions or something like that, and that becomes automatic. So that's kind of blurring that distinction between non-nuclear issues and nuclear issues. And then a third scenario would be that the nuclear deal actually falls apart in Congress, where the U.S. tries to negotiate or tries to come up with a new law, but Trump rejects it. He's already said if he doesn't get what he wants, he will promise to pull out of the deal, and that could then just basically have the U.S. pulling out, and then essentially the ball's in Iran's court to respond if they want to actually remove themselves from the deal as well and restart the nuclear program. And then I think there's the last kind of wild card scenario where while we've been talking about how Trump faces an uphill battle with the Europeans on getting a much united front against Iran's other activities, is that we actually do start to see negotiations start to form in some level, whether that's over Iran's ballistic missile program or Iran's activities somewhere else. Again, this is a much more of a wild card scenario, but it's a different one than just the United States kind of doing things on their own.
So I'd actually like to talk about that wildcard scenario last, but what are some of the risks and opportunities associated with each scenario as we see them?
So the first scenario really is that we continue in the state that we're in, where the JCPOA remains intact, essentially, weakened somewhat by the US very clearly not having confidence in it, but none of those secondary sanctions that were preventing European companies from investing in Iran and with Iran, none of those are snapped back. That is the situation that we're in right now, and that's where you're going to continue to see European companies and countries really showing a significant amount of interest in upping their bilateral trade with Iran, supplying things like vehicles, and really important for Iran, and one of the reasons they want this scenario to be the one that remains is that these countries and companies are going to invest in Iran's oil and gas sector. Iran's oil and gas sector needs a significant amount of international investment to move beyond the state that it's in right now in order to increase its production capacity and maintain what it has already. So right now, this is not the ideal state for a lot of European companies that are anxious about what's going to happen in Washington in terms of, what is Congress cooking up in terms of new sanctions.
But it might be the best scenario, and I think
it might be the best scenario,
right? When we look
for
at
business with Iran,
right? When we look at the second scenario, which blurs that distinction, then it becomes a question of can Iran actually pull back some of the support that it may have been giving to a group like the Houthis, for example. If the United States put into place constraints on Iran being able to support the Houthis or any other proxy that it has or its ballistic missile program, and then it automatically snaps back, say, nuclear-related sanctions, that's a much higher risk for international companies that are trying to do business with Iran because there's more triggers. And to some degree, there's an open question as to whether or not Iran can even pull back that support enough to stop any kind of an attack, for example, or something in the Persian Gulf, something like that. And then it becomes a question of will the United States then use that as a reason to pressure Iran even more so and kind of say, Iran, we do this now with cause.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And then the other, the fourth scenario, kind of the falls apart one, that's
the fourth or the third.
The third, excuse me, the third. Thank you, Ben. The third scenario, which kind of has the nuclear deal falling apart because Congress pulls out of it, that's obviously the worst scenario, I think, for a lot of international companies, because then they are risking having sanctions placed onto them if they stop business with Iran. And then they're also hoping then that the US or the EU governments can actually apply enough pressure on the U.S. through the WTO or some of these other mechanisms to keep those sanctions off if they want to continue doing their business activities.
And we should say that within the second scenario, which is that there are new triggers put in place that if Iran does anything that the United States thinks is destabilizing or doesn't like, that there could be new harsher sanctions put onto Iran. This is, as Matthew mentioned, this is very this creates a very uncertain environment for European companies because Iran in the region is not showing any willingness to back down from some of the activities that the United States views as destabilizing. Matthew mentioned the Houthi rebels in Yemen. We've seen increased capabilities from those Houthi rebels in terms of launching missiles, and those are widely believed to be a result of some Iranian training and some support. And this is something that if we keep seeing that those types of missile launches coming from Yemen towards Saudi Arabia or anywhere else, the United States is going to be very motivated to try and clamp down and help Saudi Arabia clamp down on what Iran's doing in Yemen. And that's just one example. I think also in Syria and Iraq, there are many places where the United States could try and do something. And so for European companies, they're looking at a situation where they don't really know what's going to emerge from Congress, and they don't really know what's going to happen 6 months from now when perhaps the White House wants to look at different ways to add new sanctions.
And also triggers. On that scenario, the second scenario, that one that's the gray area scenario, it's also worth thinking about Iran's reaction to that scenario. Because in that scenario, because the EU companies are really going to be on the fence about what happens on that, the actual reasons for Iran to stay in the deal might be weakened because they wouldn't be getting the investment that they've been desiring because of the deal. So we might actually see Iran kind of shift its own strategy within that framework as well, which only reinforces that it could fall apart. It's much more fragile than in the first scenario, which was the more kind of status quo scenario.
But I think it's important to note as well that just as there are differing factions within Washington over how to deal with Iran going forward, in Tehran itself, there are internal divisions between the moderates and the hardliners and people who are a little bit more progressive. So let's look at the wildcard option here. What happens then?
So if the deal completely falls apart, one, we should mention what that does for, of course, companies that are showing an interest in investing in with Iran, companies like Total and BP and big names. They are, it's going to make it very difficult to invest, because suddenly there is no real legal limit on Iran's nuclear activity. And that's something that there's going to be an emerging new effort to try and piece together something else, some other sort of deal that they can use to limit Iran's nuclear activity. But Iran's not going to have any incentive to perhaps not restart its nuclear activity.
And then also think about, because Iran is so divided, that if we're in this kind of a gray area scenario, or the JCPOA is gone, or even if we're having a scenario where they're negotiating, getting all of the Iranian factions on board for the first deal was a very tall order for the Supreme Leader and President Hassan Rouhani. So it's not clear whether or not that faction can actually reemerge right now. Iran's going through its own internal divisions right now. Rouhani was essentially elected with the mandate to negotiate the nuclear deal. Now that that's gone, you could definitely see some of the hardline IRGC saying, okay, we actually cannot give up anything on our nuclear or our missile programming. So they will be less willing to kind of, include those things. That was a big sticking point in the first round of negotiations, was making sure that the ballistic missile program, which Iran to a certain degree has a legitimate reason for national defense to have just for protecting its own territories, would want to keep in no matter what. There's a little way for Iran to necessarily pull back from its ballistic missile testing. Now, maybe on the range of the missiles is one possibility that could happen. There's maybe not a reason for having to have missiles that can go beyond 2,000 kilometers or something like that. But it is something that that division actually prevents them from being able to actually fully come on board with a wholesome new negotiated settlement of a new JCPOA 2.0, if you will.
So I think it's also worth mentioning at the moment that Iran is currently in full compliance with the JCPOA, right? So with our forecasting hats on, what do we think is the most likely way this will play out, accepting there are a number of destabilizing factors that could rise up here? What do we think is realistic?
So I think the first scenario is kind of the one we're in right now. If you want to look at it from the Trump administration's perspective, you can make the argument that a lot of the stuff that we did with the pushing it back to Congress is essentially just saying, okay, the ball's in Congress's court. I'm going to let Congress decide with this. I'm going to wash my hands of actually being the one that pulls out of the deal. If Congress decides to pull out of the deal, then I will comply with that. But I do think that, as Emily spoke to earlier, that there are a lot of constraints from the U.S. Congress from actually wanting to do that, whether it's the relationship with the EU, also the question about do they actually want to restart the nuclear program or have Iran restart its nuclear program in the middle of dealing with the nuclear crisis with North Korea, for example. I mean, that's another constraint that Congress would definitely not move upon pretty heavily. So I think that that's probably the most likely scenario, but I wouldn't rule out the Trump administration kind of blurring that distinction on nuclear sanctions and non-nuclear sanctions to a certain degree. What that looks like, it's hard to be clear, but I don't think it's going to be codified into a way that it's automatically triggered. And then also, I think the bigger issue is that if Iran infringes on the nuclear deal on any point, this administration is going to respond much more strongly, much more swiftly than the Obama administration would have.
And I think in this first scenario, which we do think is most likely, and again, as you mentioned, it is relatively uncertain. We could, over time, especially depending on what Iran does in the Middle East, we could see moving more towards the second scenario where they try and come up with some way to put in new triggers that would allow them to put on harsher sanctions. But right now, in that first scenario, European companies, they are able to invest in and with Iran. There's still a lot of sanctions infrastructure on Iran as a country, but there are ways for the oil and gas sector to court investment. It's just that there is a significant amount of risk there because there's always the question of, will the United States choose to put up some sort of sanction that's related to an IRGC-linked group. There are a lot of companies in Iran that are linked to the IRGC. And we saw that just in late October, that the United States issued new sanctions linked to specific IRGC entities. The United States has also issued sanctions on Hezbollah. And so investing with anything that's linked to Hezbollah in Lebanon became very difficult. So there's a lot of just having to be very clear about exactly who you're investing with and exactly what that company is linked to within Iran or in the region.
And I think that's a good point to kind of think about this more regionally, because in a scenario where the United States, no matter what, is having a more aggressive policy towards Iran in general, and this is also to do with Saudi Arabia also having a similar policy, is that the conflicts in the proxy theaters between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the U.S., those are also areas where energy producers are at. So I've already seen some elements where we've seen that dispute bleed over into the oil sector. For example, there was the pipeline explosion in Bahrain over the weekend. Now, it's not clear if what degree Iran was behind it or whether or not they were supporting the militants who done it, but that is one theater where it could impact stuff. The same thing is true in Yemen, where there is still oil production. The same thing is true in northern Iraq. So there could be regional ramifications for energy companies or just global regional commerce that are beyond just the investment opportunities or just Iran's oil exports.
This seems to come back to the heart of the issue that what is fueling the discord between Europe and the United States is the fact that fundamentally Europe see things slightly differently, and they're more focused on the JCPOA, whereas the US is seeing the broader implications of Iran's activities in the region. Let's just say that for whatever reason, the wheels fall off the cart. What's the worst case scenario here? What are going to be the regional implications of this thing completely falling apart?
I mean, I think the first, if the wheels fall off, if the deal is gone, the absolute worst case scenario is that Iran restarts its nuclear program, and that significantly, impacts the security of the region and of U.S. allies and of EU allies in a big way. That's worst case scenario. And
then also, not only do they restart the nuclear program, that within 5 years or whatever that time period is, they get very, very close to gaining a nuclear weapon. We would definitely see a different response than what we've seen with North Korea towards Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon. That brings into the question of the United States' overall strategy in terms of it puts the military option to prevent Iran's nuclear program back on the table, where it's not been for a couple of years now.
And because this worst case scenario is so dire, and again, this is a worst case scenario, this is not the scenario that we think we're moving towards. That's why you have parties that were very unhappy about the Iran deal in the first place, because they were countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like Israel, that were unhappy about something that would allow Iran's economy to reinvigorate. They're happy about the idea of limiting Iranian activity, but they don't want the JCPOA as a deal altogether to just be pulled out. They don't want the rug pulled out from under the JCPOA very suddenly, because they see it. They do recognize that Iran wants this deal in place, and Iran has remained in compliance with the deal. And that has been good for global security in terms of keeping Iran from developing a nuclear weapon.
But it's also, in some ways, you can argue, given Iran a bit of more of a freer hand to work regionally, which is, again, why the Trump administration has been trying to counter that policy, essentially.
Right.
Well, Emily, Matt, before we take a quick break for some questions, I just want to make sure you both had an opportunity to say everything you wanted to say in this segment. Are there any final words at this point?
I don't think so.
No, I think the other big implication here that is beyond just Saudi or Iran, and for the energy sector in particular, is that if this nuclear deal does fall apart or is triggered, that's actually going to in some ways boost energy markets, just because Iran is a major oil exporter. You'll see its oil production fall pretty dramatically, pretty quickly, obviously. And at that point, there's a lot of other questions about how that then impacts both Saudi Arabia's budget, Saudi Arabia's Iraq's budget, and all these other things. So there's a big kind of global dynamic that is just beyond Iran in a lot of different ways.
Well, I think it's a good place to jump off now and take a quick break. We hope you enjoyed the first segment. And before we share some messages, I think it's important to mention that the Stratfor, we've been doing this for more than 2 decades, and we're a trusted provider of geopolitical forecast for individuals, businesses, governments globally. Our approach is very non-biased, it's objective, and certainly the way we look at the world allows you to see around corners. Our bespoke methodology has been a key decision support tool for businesses across a variety of sectors, be it defense, agriculture, finance, biotech. We have a number of, like I say, individuals and clients that use our information to help them make better decisions about the future. And everything we do is based around the idea of a forecast, trying to look ahead into the future and make wise decisions based upon what will happen. And I think that's important to note here is we don't look at how the world ought to be, we look at the way it is and the way it will be in the future. And we look forward by quarter, annually for the year ahead. And also we have forecasts to look ahead to the next decade and even the next century. So using geopolitics, we really pick apart the world, looking at history, geography, politics, and we make accurate deductions for the future. So before we move on to the Q&A, I would like to share a few messages, so please stay tuned. And also, you'll get a chance to hear our Vice President of Strategic Intelligence, Roger Baker, talk a little bit more about Stratfor's geopolitical approach to making sense of the world and international affairs. Thank you.
We live in an increasingly complex world full of risk and opportunity. To make sense of it, you need to cut through the noise and look beyond the headlines to understand what's truly important right now and in the future. That's why globally engaged individuals, professionals, and Fortune 500 companies turn to Stratfor Worldview. Worldview delivers objective geopolitical intelligence and strategic forecasting that reveal the underlying significance and future implications of emerging world events. That is Stratfor. That is your world in context.
In many ways, one of the values of geopolitical analysis, as opposed to just purely political analysis, is that it builds a frame and a model for the world. And it uses history, it uses geography, it uses economics and politics and society and security and technology to try to build and understand these frames. And then it uses that to test the flow of information that we're seeing. One of the biggest challenges I think that we have today in business, in government, and in common life is the flood of information. It's very hard to find through this extreme flow of noise around us what is significant. What are the underlying trends that we should be aware of, as opposed to the volatility of the day-to-day media? And by using geopolitics, we're able to start to distill out of that volatility a deeper pattern. And if you can be identifying that deeper pattern, it can help you be prepared ahead of time for changes. It can help you understand the noise that you're seeing on a day-to-day basis. And ideally, it can help you forecast changes in directionality regionally, internationally of these major global trends.
Okay, so before we move on to our question and answer section, it's just worth mentioning that actually we have a number of levels of access for our primary offering, which is Worldview. We do a subscription-based model, which is more based for individuals who want access to our geopolitical analysis and insights. We also have a team-based model, which gives you more access to our larger scale reports. You have unlimited access to everything that we produce in long form, and these are an invaluable resource for teams and larger corporations. We also have an enterprise offering, which gives you a lot more opportunity to interact with the analyst team that we have here, represented by Emily and Matt Bay today. And also, there are a number of other items that you can gain access to. We're launching an API soon, which will definitely improve our integration of our content into your existing platforms and workflows. So there's a number of opportunities that enterprise specifically presents for corporations and businesses. So if you have further information, please follow up after this and look into our various offerings. But for now, on with the question and answer. We have a few questions coming in. I'd like to start with one by Charles, who asked, are Iranian people willing to do business more likely with a US or a European business? Is one more likely than the other? And I know that there are some factors affecting this.
Well, it's, I think there's a strong appetite in Iran to grow the economy. There's been heavy sanctions on Iran for years in various forms. Especially under the rule of Ahmadinejad. So I think there's a lot of appetite to invest in, whatever company can help an Iranian company really court the investment that it needs and grow the business.
And Iran has actually specifically said that we would love for American companies to become here.
Exactly.
But
so
can they?
But that's the problem is Iran has an appetite, has said, we would love to invest with everyone. The problem is there's a lot of intense sanctions infrastructure still in place that it's very, very, very difficult, pretty much impossible for a United States company to invest with an Iranian company and vice versa.
And even when we've seen where the JCPOA allowed for Iran and the US to do business, so for example, the Boeing deal, that's actually kind of, hit hard times, basically.
Right. So there was a very, very specific loophole written into some sanctions language that allowed Boeing to potentially sell aircraft to Iran Air, I think maybe 100 aircraft. And even that deal, despite that being a big loophole, it ran into all sorts of issues and is still it's stalled. It's not completely on it's on ice. But so I think it's much easier for Iranian companies to invest or work with or trade with an EU company. And there are a lot of countries. I'm thinking of Austria, which has a very healthy relationship with Iran, Italy, France to some extent, which is showing a lot of willingness to work with the US on trying to limit Iranian activity in some ways, is still trying to sell as much as they can to Iran. And of course, their major oil and gas company, Total, is one of the major companies that's been talking about, escalating its investments in Iran in a huge way. So I think it's easier for the EU and Iran.
It's easier, but I think from the Iranians' perspective, I don't think they're necessarily making a distinction between the two. But right now, they basically can only work with the Europeans.
Yeah. Well, Charles, I hope that answers your question. And we have a question now from Rich, who wants to know, why do the five powers have any confidence that Iran is not cheating on its nuclear restraint, given the time lag allowed before investigations are announced and when they actually occur?
That's a good question, because there is a significant amount of trust that goes into what the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, which is the association that monitors Iran's compliance with the nuclear deal through regular checkups that are written into the deal. And there are various reports that Iran has to supply to the international community. There are various meetings in Vienna that regularly go through this. But there is a significant amount of trust that Iran is supplying the information that the international community needs to see. And I think that's why you do have a justifiable sense of uncertainty over, is Iran exactly complying in every which way? But with the deal as it's written, Iran is in compliance, at least with the data that the IAEA has supplied. Iran has, I think, erred twice. By a tiny amount, with like an extra ton of heavy water, and they immediately sold it.
It's worth noting, though, that you're right, there's a delay, and that's a problem or a concern that a lot of people do have. But the United States or any other member of the P5+1 countries, the group of countries that negotiated this, can then go to the IAEA with cause and saying, hey, we actually suspect a certain site. And then there's a mechanism within that Iran has to open it up. Now, that opening up period is only a matter of weeks. It's not something that has to happen within days, which is a concern. But there are mechanisms there in order to look at these things. And what's significant, though, is that although there is a trust element to that, we're also talking about the United States having one of the most powerful intelligence apparatuses in the world, also getting information from the Israelis, who have a very powerful intelligence apparatus as well. There are some ways that the United States can monitor beyond the IAEA through covert means that could inform the United States about asking about specific sites. And then the question is will the United States give enough information, if they find any, which obviously we're not privy to that information, then give to the IAEA and then see that kind of response afterwards.
Great, thank you. We have a question from David, who would like to know what would constitute an action that Iran could take in order for us to take action? And by us, I presume he means the United States here.
There are certainly a number of. We've seen a pattern when Iran has done. When we talk about Iran's destabilizing activities, which in some ways is this very vague term, but it's often what's used in Washington to talk about the whole suite of things that Iran does in the Middle East that the United States thinks is detrimental to the security of its allies in the region. Things like aggressive activity in the Persian Gulf with respect to the IRGC's naval forces. There have been examples of harassment between Iranian vessels and trying to intimidate U.S. vessels or the vessels of U.S. allies. Those are the kind of things that actually you see them lead to discussions in Congress over, what's Iran's ultimate intent here? If they can harass us in the Persian Gulf, they're showing that they have some sort of ability to threaten our allies. What about their ballistic missile program? There's a concern that Iran can always escalate what it's doing and actually attack U.S. allies.
And another good example of that could actually be the support or alleged support to supporting the Houthis missile program, for example. We did see the attempted attack on Riyadh just 2 weeks ago. So something like that in terms of where Iran might be providing either the missile itself or the guidance systems, things like that on accuracy. Now, another thing to look at, though, are some of the things that Iran can do on its nuclear program that would trigger different issues of sanctions in our kind of our forecasts going forward. And that could include obvious actions like the United States uncovers higher enrichment than what we expected, or much more heavy water, or there's undercover hidden nuclear research facility that Iran has not divulged information about. So things like that would be what to look for. But again, it's hard to see those kinds of nuclear related activities until it's obvious, like, oh, wait, they did this and somebody uncovered it. And that's kind of the first information that we get.
Yeah, and I think Matthew's getting to a really important point of making sure that there are the nuclear related activities, which will immediately trigger something very, very strong and very harsh, because technically still those are made illegal by the JCPOA, and Iran could that would trigger a snapback of a lot of sanctions, and Iran doesn't want to snap back.
It would also trigger the EU getting on board with some of the US's actions if Iran violates a nuclear deal, because that's what they want to prevent. So that could actually move away from this kind of weird tension between the EU and the US towards a more of alliance if Iran makes that action.
But then there's the whole suite of non-nuclear related issues, and that's sort of where we're in that uncomfortable gray space of, well, Iran doesn't like a lot of what the United States is doing in the Middle East. The US doesn't like a lot of what Iran is doing in the Middle East. And Iran, its mentality is often, this is our turf. We don't need all these forward deployed US soldiers at bases all along the Persian Gulf. What are you doing in Syria? What are you doing in Iraq? And we've seen Iran progressively maintain a forward deployment through a lot of its militias. And I think that that's one area to watch over the coming years is there are some inevitable points of tension, potentially clashes between US-backed forces and Iran-backed forces. And those are types of things that could snowball into a conversation over how do we limit what Iran's doing in the region.
So focusing on a particular destabilizing event that happened recently, Basma wants to know, what's the plausibility of each scenario given the evolving crisis in Lebanon and Iran's stake in Hezbollah?
So, yeah, this is really interesting because what we've seen happen in Lebanon is a really concerted effort on the part of Saudi Arabia, which happens to be one of the United States' biggest allies in the region. And we've seen that relationship really warm up over the last year. In particular, we've seen Saudi Arabia show a willingness to really challenge Iran in some of those proxy zones. Lebanon being one place where really Iran and Saudi Arabia have tussled over the amount of political influence and control that they have on the ground for years. I mean, Saudi Arabia was a major part of settling the Lebanese civil war back in 1990. And part of that settlement was written with a great concern over what Iran was doing in Lebanon through Hezbollah and its militant and political arms. So in a sense, it's a cyclical thing that happens between Saudi Arabia and Iran with respect to Lebanon. But I do think that it is concerning for, I think it's something that we have to think about in the context of the second scenario, because Hezbollah it's been a designated terrorist organization per the United States for years. And anything that Hezbollah does, the United States is already on board to say, we don't really like what Hezbollah is doing in the region. And so as we see Saudi Arabia moving more visibly against Hezbollah, I think that there's a possibility that Hezbollah politically is going to make sure that its turf is made very clear. And so there's just a chance of there being more of a political clashes that will lead to the United States siding with Saudi Arabia and saying, hey, we also agree with you. We want to help limit what's happening here.
And under the status quo scenario, it's worth mentioning, though, that since the United States is still giving a bunch of support to Saudi Arabia's overall regional strategy, is that Saudi Arabia still has a pretty free hand to be as aggressive as it possibly can on Lebanon. Now, there are lots of constraints to that strategy, but it does allow Saudi Arabia to be pretty much as aggressive at once. And then that does not say feed back into the other scenarios, but rather just the general climate in Lebanon.
Right.
So Rich wants to know, how much money and market access was offered by each of the signatories to the deal? From what has been reported, it seems like the US has allowed more market access as well as put up more hard cash than other countries. Is the P5 interest purely self-serving?
So I believe he's referring to the money that was unlocked or unfrozen from the United States, and then potentially, I guess, the Boeing deal. I think that's one way to look at it in terms of the United States giving up money in the sense of unfreezing what were already Iranian assets that were just frozen from beforehand. I guess if you just look at the money, that's a part of it. But if you do look at the other economic activities, when we talk about the potential investments that's more than 2 to 4, or it's going to be like 4 to 6 billion from just Total alone, if they finalize that deal, you talk about China, all of the oil that it's been buying from Iran for a long time, which totals into the billions of dollars a year. If you look then at Germany, who has some of its companies teasing with the idea of not only investing in its energy sector, but some of its auto sectors and other sectors, is I don't necessarily see how we can say that the United States, because the U.S. companies down the road cannot invest as much, would have much more of an interest in self-serving from that aspect, just because we're talking about a long-term investment. Now, initially with unfreezing of assets, that's different. The UK had to unfreeze some of the assets, I believe, as well, that they had. But that being said, is it just self-serving? Well, all deals are self-serving to a certain extent. I don't think this is just self-serving in the financial sense for any of the countries. You can make the argument that maybe China wants more investments in opportunities in Iran, but they were already doing a lot of that even when the JCPOA, or before the JCPOA, when Iran was sanctioned. When we look at a lot of the European countries, I think there is a general concern about the nuclear program to begin with, and once they actually had that, once Iran was willing to come to the table on that issue, that was fine with them. They're not nearly as concerned with Iran's regional activities as the United States is, because the United States is the leading external actor that is trying to exert its own agenda on the Middle East.
That leads us on nicely to the next question we have from Tarif, who wants to know, how could containing Iran in places such as Syria or Iraq or Lebanon actually play out? Is an escalation of any sort of, or an escalation to any form of military confrontation, is that a plausible scenario in your opinion?
So this is a good question, and it's actually, containing Iranian activity in the Middle East and North Africa is one of the listed 4 prongs of this new strategy that President Trump articulated. I think we've seen this lead to a very heavy reliance on regional allies, which is something that predates President Trump's administration. So Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Arab Gulf states, who share, to varying degrees, also a concern about what's happening with Iran in the region, that in some ways they see as being counter to their own interests and counter to their own security. We've seen Trump rely on, not just Trump, but Washington in the Obama administration and the Trump administration rely on those Gulf allies. But in some ways, we really have to look at the constraints. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is a very viable military and political force. Saudi Arabia has tried for years and years and years to support the Sunni space in Lebanon as well as the Christians as sort of a counterweight, but the demographics don't make sense. There's simply not a militia force that has emerged or that's likely to emerge from the Sunnis that could be an actual counterweight to Hezbollah. So we see in Lebanon, we're really looking over the next few months ways that Saudi Arabia can try and limit the financial activity that flows between Saudi Arabia and Lebanon. That would be one way to limit it. But in terms of actual military conflict in that proxy zone, it doesn't seem very likely. But one place to look is Syria. We have seen more of an interest from Arab Gulf states in supporting some of the rebel factions that are not on really the same side of the civil conflict as Iran-backed factions. It's a little complicated because a lot of them are fighting the same enemy right now in eastern Syria, the Islamic State. But the question, of course, with Syria is what happens when the Islamic State's gone and all focus is now on the civil conflict? You're going to have a lot of Iran-backed forces. And if the Arab Gulf states do marshal more support for groups like the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which has been in discussion over the last few months, then you could see an actual conflict there. But again, it's going to be a proxy conflict. We're not talking about volleys over the Persian Gulf. We're just not at that scenario yet.
And also proxy conflicts don't necessarily have to be only done through militancy. So when we talk about the Syria context, it can happen like in the post-IS conflict where we're talking about rebuilding some of these areas. Mm-hmm. Another good place where we've seen this kind of policy evolving over the last year is in Iraq. Mm-hmm. In Iraq, we have seen the Saudis in particular, the UAE in particular, reach out to not only the Sunni camp within Iraq, but also some of the more nationalist Shiite camps that have traditionally been more associated with Iran. Iran is much more supportive of the Shiite community in Iraq. But we've seen, for example, Muqtada al-Sadr make a trip to Saudi Arabia. We've seen Saudi Arabia restart some of its ties. The foreign minister went there for the first time, I believe, in 25 years. And we've seen them moving towards opening up consulates in Najaf and, I believe, Basra.
Karbala.
Excuse me. So there is a broader pushback politically in Iraq towards trying to at least, and they can't push back against Iran, but at least strengthen that nationalist segment of Iran's Shiite parties so they can at least not have to go so closely to what Iran wants. To kind of give them some sort of independence and supporting them that way. So there can be non-violent ways of doing this.
Yeah,
as well.
So there's political, economic, and actual military aspects to how that proxy conflict is going to play out. But we don't see it as being, this gigantic actual military conflict between, pitting Saudi allies versus Iranian allies. It's just, we're not even close to that situation.
And even in the one case where we probably have seen that to the largest degree would be Yemen. And even in Yemen, it's an open question as to how much of that was basically Iran supporting the Houthis. The Houthis have long-standing concerns in Yemen that predate a lot of their support that they've gotten from Iran. So it is a proxy zone, but it was triggered by a lot of different issues.
So to talk a little bit more about the proxy scenario, Stavros wants to know if there's a possibility of the US getting drawn into any proxy conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
I think, one thing that we were talking about just this morning was the question of, how long does the US maintain a presence in Syria as a stabilizer? The US backs certain forces in Syria that are fighting the Islamic State. The US has not really gotten involved in the civil conflict and has even, under the Trump administration, really visibly pulled back from any type of involvement with the civil conflict that's happening in Western Syria. But in Eastern Syria, again, I think you do have this question of, is the US going to be, through proxies, not US soldiers on sort of the front lines, but as you're talking about stabilizing and rebuilding areas, you have to have military forces in those areas. Iran has hundreds of militias that it has backed and supported and trained over years, and they have pretty strategically made sure that they are placed throughout Syria and throughout Iraq, as well as in Lebanon. I think there is a valid question of, is the US going to be involved through supporting various proxies that are also trying to stabilize those spaces, perhaps trying to support Sunni communities, since most of these militias that Iran backs are Shiite, not all of them, but most of them. And so I think that's a valid question, that the US could continually be drawn into that, and that could also snowball into a larger diplomatic conflict between the two.
I think the big thing to look for there are a couple of things. Is one, that when these spaces emerge where there are these conflicts, that you have extremist groups emerge, that's where the United States is definitely going to be stepping in more militarily with airstrikes or on the ground support of local actors and things like that. In these broader proxy conflicts that haven't necessarily allowed for that space, you could definitely see the United States supporting one side or the other through money that they can to a certain extent, depending on sanctions. But it's also worth mentioning that there's still not a huge appetite in the United States to actually put a significant footprint on the ground anywhere in the Middle East. We even saw yesterday, I believe, the House of Representatives basically passing a non-binding resolution questioning the U.S.'s action in Iran against the Shiite communities, which is, again, looking at the question.
Yemen.
Or excuse me, Yemen. Thank you. Yemen against the Shiite communities.
We don't
Iran.
have
Yeah, in Yemen against the Shiite communities, saying that it's not authorized under the War Act, which was going against extremist organizations. So that kind of does limit to the extent that the White House or the U.S. can get involved in some of these proxy conflicts, even though it can definitely be doing things like airstrikes behind the scenes against VEOs and other terrorist organizations.
Also, as the US is looking to reinvigorate its commitment towards Afghanistan, they don't necessarily want to flare up in the Middle East.
And they're looking to East Asia and sort of the looming question of conflict with DPRK. So
and the Russia stuff is not over either.
Right.
That's important to note, is that this is not happening in isolation. There's a lot going on around the world for Washington to be concerned about. To pivot back to the money real quick, Terry wants to know, what use would new American sanctions on Iran actually be if they would only hinder Western companies from making money, while Chinese and Russian companies would certainly continue to invest in the country, potentially helping the Iranians to achieve their overall goals?
So if we go back, though, to the united sanctions front that we had 2012 between the EU and the US, let's assume that the EU is actually on board with something. And then that does enable the Russians or that does potentially allow the Russians or the Chinese to do some business with Iran. But at the same time, while China was willing to make investments in Iran, we actually saw Iran's oil production go down significantly. So the revenue went down significantly. It went down by about a million barrels per day of exports. That's roughly about 1/2 to 1/3 or 2/3 of their oil production. So that is a substantial limiter on that activity. Now, when we talk about investment into Iran, actually the Chinese didn't have all that great success when they did that. We actually saw Iran actually pulling back on some of the contracts that they signed in 2013, 2014 with CNPC and some of these other companies, because either the Chinese were not fulfilling their end of the bargain or they were just bad contracts. So it's an open question as to whether or not Iran would still be able to get the investment necessarily to restart and re-jumpstart its energy sector without Western companies in particular. And also when we just think about the other strategic kind of imperatives here for Iran, is that they're doing this under is that if Iran is actually weakened substantially with the nuclear deal, who's that empowering in Iran? That's empowering the hardliners. What are the hardliners the ones that are kind of the most against? It's international investment. So there would be a kind of a reaction to some of the opening up that we've seen that has been able to attract the Totals of the world, attract some of these other companies from the West, may no longer be there anymore, because we've already seen the pushback from the hardliners even prevent some of the opening up that we've seen thus far in terms of like opening up foreign investment into some sectors.
And part of that is because they're concerned. There are companies that are linked to hardliners in Iran that have a significant stake in the oil and gas sector, and so they're concerned about international investment impinging on some of what they've already built. But there is still, as we've talked about, there is an appetite shared across the political spectrum in Iran to keep sanctions off of the economy. They just want to be sure that investment that comes in is allotted in the way that they think is best.
And it's also not necessarily in Russia's interest for Iran to become a nuclear state either.
Right.
So we've probably got time for one more question. And Charles would like to know, how much has the Iran-Iraq war affected Iran and its perspective of working with countries, Western countries, in the future?
The Iran-Iraq war?
Yes.
Okay.
So I think the thing to think about there is that historically, when we just look at Iran as a country, it's one where or whatever happens in Iraq always seems to matter. Under Saddam Hussein, Saddam invaded once. So this is like almost like the soft underbelly of the ways that historically other regional actors have been able to impinge upon Iran. So when Iran saw Saddam knocked off, they saw this as an opportunity. It doesn't matter who knocked him off. They saw this as an opportunity to essentially extend their own influences into the Shiite communities of Iraq. So this is something that is necessity going to be driving them necessarily to be doing that no matter what. It doesn't matter if the U.S. is involved. It doesn't matter if the U.S. kind of pulls back, or in some other Western country becomes more of the kind of the interactor or mediator in Iraq, for that matter. But does this necessarily change their viewpoints towards the West in terms of what the United States was doing? I think a lot of that was already there. I mean, before 2003, we already saw the United States go in pretty strongly in the Gulf War. That actually froze a kind of a negotiating process in Iran where they were actually debating the question about trying to improve relations with the West and the United States in particular. So it does to that degree, but I think that a lot of those seeds have already been sown. The question going forward, though, is I think more on the nuclear issue, because that actually brings up the question of trust. Can you trust the United States in some fashion? Iran has already negotiated with the West over its nuclear program a couple of times, and the United States a couple of times before, even this time around, has kind of slammed the door in their face. So the question is for Iran going forward, and this is kind of the core debate that goes on in Iran a lot, is can we even negotiate with the United States on broader issues beyond the nuclear one when they don't necessarily always keep their end of the bargain without us actually changing our behavior? So I think that is the bigger thing right now about the affecting the perception of Iran with the United States.
Well, I think that is a good place to end this. I would just like to take an opportunity to thank Stratfor analysts Emily Hawthorne and Matthew Bay for being here today. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know how busy you are, so I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule. I'd also like to thank everybody for joining us in this live webcast today, and I look forward to seeing everyone in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. And as a quick reminder, we will be sharing a link to the recording of today's presentation once it becomes available. And if you'd like to learn or get more Stratfor analysis on these underlying geopolitical drivers that play in the region and our forecast on future trends related to Iran and the Middle East, visit us at worldview.stratfor.com. And if you're interested in learning how Stratfor Worldview for teams and enterprises can help your organization identify new opportunities and mitigate global risk, you can reach us by email at business@stratfor.com or by phone at 1-512-744-4300, option 4. Thanks once again for joining us for today's webcast, brought to you by Stratfor Worldview.